Okay, guys, we're continuing with conservation of biodiversity today. Here is the junior cert learning outcome that you're supposed to have achieved by the end of this chapter. And we are going to look at evaluating how humans are going to successfully conserve biodiversity, contribute to global food production, and then talk about the benefits from those ecosystems. We kind of talked about benefits already. The main things here we want to focus on today really are talking about defining biodiversity, ecology, and ecosystems. We're going to talk about interactions between ecosystems and in ecosystems. So, like between ecosystems would be like, for example, how does a river interact with a soil ecosystem, or how does a grassland interact with a river? Okay, and the interactions then in the ecosystem themselves would be between organisms. So, like for example, predation, parasitism would be examples of interactions in that environment. We're then going to look at how our populations of a species controlled ultimately in an ecosystem. Okay, so I'm sure you've seen loads of documentaries before about nature and organisms in our planet, and really when we talk about biodiversity, we talk about the huge variety of different types of species on our planet. Okay, now if you look at the numbers here, we're talking about numbers of species on our planet. You're talking in the region of millions and millions of different species, and then there's subspecies besides, so like there is an enormous amount of variety in our planet, and unfortunately, at the moment, we are undergoing, and this is accepted, by the way, the sixth mass extinction because humans have become such a dominant organism in the world that they're effectively, um, preventing other organisms from surviving. I mean, think about Ireland back in the day. Ireland used to have wild boars, wolves, bears. Foxes are still there and would have been quite populous. The Irish hare and all of these different animals, which we don't see as often maybe as we used to. Okay, like in the case of the hare and the fox, and obviously then the wolf and the bear and the wild boar, they're all extinct. So like that is biodiversity. Biodiversity is the variety of living things. So this whole field here of ecology, a group of people decided here that um, well, certainly in the modern day, that it's important to conserve biodiversity and it's important to protect nature because we know the benefits that it provides for us. So this whole field here of ecology is all about studying ecosystems. So ecology is the study of ecosystems effectively. Okay, and now this is a very old science. Ecology, has been biologist. It's one of the original biologies. Branches of biology where you study ecosystems, and there's the obvious benefits there in terms of like medicine and resources as well. Like you want to be able to identify the different species as well. Like for example, mosquitoes are a huge problem in certain parts of the world, like certain parts of Asia and Africa, and it's a good idea to have an idea of how do mosquitoes breed, how do they when are they most abundant, in order to try and control them. Okay, because mosquitoes carry many very dangerous diseases, like for example malaria. So if we were trying to manage malaria as a disease, then maybe we should have an idea of how of the science behind the mosquito, which would come into the field of ecology. So when we're talking about biodiversity here, according to your book, and now there's going to be very like new species are being discovered every day. But here they're saying that there's 8.7 million different species on our planet, and as I said here, this excludes like subspecies, and it also excludes the bacteria. The bacteria we reckon are the most diverse group of all, and actually this would be many, many, many millions more if we included the bacteria. Like bacteria, for example, when you get a sore throat, that's a particular species of bacteria that causes a sore throat. It's called Streptococcus. So there's lots of published, scientific articles on this. There is a journal called Biodiversity, and this here is Biodiversity Ireland. In Ireland alone, there's a huge biodiversity of insects. Okay, actually, we have loads of insects in Ireland, and that would be our most abundant biodiversity, where we'd find most of the biodiversity in Ireland. In Ireland, you may not be familiar with all of these, but these are all Irish species, okay? This guy here is the red squirrel. The red squirrel is a native species, and mostly the red squirrel is found in the west of Ireland because, unfortunately, and this is true for Moyle Park College as well, the American grey squirrel has effectively taken over its habitat. Okay, the red squirrels were hunted almost to extinction for their fur, and the grey squirrel is a dominant kind of cousin that is able to take over the red squirrel's habitats. But fortunately, in recent times, these red squirrels have been coming back, and it's related to another native Irish species, which we thought at one stage we thought that were extinct, which is known as the pine marten. Okay, and the pine marten looks a little bit like this guy here. This is actually a stoat. Okay, a stoat, which you often find along rivers and coastal ecosystems. We are all familiar with the fox, okay, another native Irish species. And down here, then we have alder, okay, which is a type of tree. You know it by its seeds. We have holly, which produces these red berries, which are really important for birds, over the winter. And then we have acorns. So, in other words, we have an oak tree there, which again is another tree that would be native to Ireland as well. So, in the nature of science, it says here that we have, I'm after losing that now, 31,000 different species in Ireland, and that would include the animals and plants, but it doesn't include insects. We have a lot more insects than that. Right. So, if we talk about ecology and what does it all have to do with biodiversity, well, ecology is the study of an ecosystem, and really what ecology is about is trying to understand like the interactions between organisms in the environment. So technically the definition for ecology, if we wanted a full definition, it's the study of interactions between organisms in the environment. At junior cert level, it'll be fine just to say ecology is the study of ecosystems. And what might we be interested in? Like, you've all heard news reports about coral reefs and coral reefs declining and becoming bleached. These fantastic ecosystems where you see such an abundance of different types of fish. An ecologist's job would be to go down there and quantify how many corals are bleaching. How can we stop it or prevent it? Okay, if we're talking about maybe, for example, in Ireland, maybe if we're talking about deer populations, what would we study there? Well, we might study like the grazing pressure. In other words, how deer graze forests, and like deer would prevent new trees from growing if you have too many deer. Okay. In a soil ecosystem, a farmer might be interested in we'll say, soil fertility. And one of the biggest indicators of soil fertility actually is if there's loads of worms inside in the soil. Worms are great because what they do is they add oxygen to the soil because they burrow through the soil and they create holes. So if an ecologist here can come along and tell a farmer, if they have a healthy number of worms in the soil, then that would give the farmer an indication that he's doing things right. Or maybe if there's an issue with soil fertility, maybe an ecologist would be able to highlight what he needs to do to make sure that more worms get into the soil. And here, it could be simply the work of an ecologist might have to do with studying, desert ecosystems and looking at, I suppose, interesting animals here, and looking at how they're adapted to these harsh environments, because a lot of time they have adaptations which may be of interest to medicine. Okay, so biodiversity so far with two definitions. Bio means living, diversity means variety. So biodiversity is the variety of living things. Ecology is the study of ecosystems. Now, often ecologists are interested in population numbers, and patterns, and by looking at the population patterns, we can get an idea then of whether we have a worry about disease, or whether, in the case of the soil ecosystem, whether the soil is healthy or not in terms of worms. So an ecologist's job can be working with any of the ecosystems I mentioned here. An ecologist's job might be simply to go out every single day into the sea and would be looking here at sampling the coral ecosystem. They might be a woodland ecologist. They might be, a desert ecologist. They might be someone who specializes in rivers. Again, next year, I might try and take you out on an ecology trip down somewhere. We'll say somewhere different. We'll try and come up with somewhere good that you'd enjoy, where you can look at the work of an ecologist. Okay, so ecosystems. Ecosystems are very, very, very complex. Okay, and in an ecosystems there are something we call interactions. An interaction is where how one organism will say affects another organism, or what relationship that those two organisms have. Like for example, in the case of a fox and a rabbit. Okay, what relationship would the fox have to the rabbit? Well, the fox is the predator, the rabbit is the prey. Okay, and you could also think about this in terms of the fox being like a what we call a consumer, and you could talk about the rabbit being a herbivore. Okay, as in the rabbit eats grass, and the fox consumes the rabbit in terms of it consumes the meat from the rabbit. Okay, so that would be like a predator-prey relationship. And that would be between species. But how else do organisms interact? Well, if we think about, for example, deer, okay, deer interact with each other, of course, and I suppose particularly deer would be well known to interact, during the breeding season when there's something called the rut, and that's where two stags, a stag is a male deer, will charge at each other and attack each other and basically try to dominate each other, so that one of the deer will get the breeding rights for the herd. So that would be an example of interaction there, and that would be what we call competition. Now, is there any other interactions that you can think about that would be relevant here? Okay, so think about that for a minute. So ideally, if you pause the video, I'm going to give out the answers now. So another interaction there would be like, for example, disease. Okay, so like all organisms have to contend with disease. And this is often carried by parasites. For example, mosquitoes would be a big carrier of disease around the world. Flies and different things would be a big carrier of disease and transfer it from one organism to another. And that is something that here is going to control the population of all organisms, that there will be a certain number of animals that unfortunately die because of disease, okay? Or makes them, weaken them due to disease, and then we have a predator catches them. So that would be another interaction there, disease, that would happen between a parasite, we'll say, and a host. Okay, like for example, parasites of for example, humans would be like the lungworm. Okay, or tapeworms would be a better example probably, where maybe a toddler has eaten sand, and by accident, and in the sand there was a number of different eggs present of lungworm, or not lungworm, but tapeworms. Well, Google this; it's not very pleasant. But a tapeworm is a big, long, stringy organism that can basically live um, inside in your body. Okay. Other interactions here would be like, I suppose we always think of animals, but plants would be another kind of organism we need to think about there. How do plants interact with each other? Well, they compete for things like light. So, plants that would be like adapted, we'll say, dominant plants like, for example, oak would take much of the light because they're such a big tree. And then plants like, for example, holly are adapted to like live in the understory of the woodland, that they would survive underneath the oak tree, and they can survive on less light. But when they're starting off as like little seedlings and growing up, they're always competing for light to try and dominate each other. Okay. And then what happens then is survival of the fittest. The best plant will survive. There's other things like competition there as well, in terms of like birds nesting on trees, like birds. I suppose there's competition for the actual tree itself, like where to nest on the tree, and that would be between birds species and within a bird population as well. Okay, so Ecosystems are made up of organisms anyway, and their interactions within that environment. So an ecosystem is not a physical thing. An ecosystem would be really just like all of the organisms and their interactions in the actual environment. So if we're talking here about, like, for example, let's just say a grassland here, for example, okay? Well, in the grassland, to be considered a grassland ecosystem, you're considering the environment itself, which is the grass and the soil, but you're also considering in the grassland ecosystem all of the organisms that live there, okay, and how they interact with each other. So, like, the deer eats the grass, the deer might be eaten by a wolf, okay, and so therefore that would be sustaining the grassland ecosystems. That's a definition there for you on an ecosystem. This is just a short little video. I don't know will it play here on the rut, but the rut here, if we look at it, there's not a load. Also, Mark, that's just. So look here, we have a deer with its trying to keep his harem nearby so that he can check. See how loud this deer is. You'll hear this during the breeding season. Okay, and that's what Ireland used to look like. Anyway, you'll see this along here shortly, where the two stags here will attack each other here like that. And that would be an example of competition. And what happens there in terms of competition there is that one of those organisms might be hurt and might end up dying as a result, or it might have to wait until the next breeding season when it's strong enough to become the dominant stag. Okay, so now what we're talking about here is like what an ecosystem is actually made of. An ecosystem is made of, as I mentioned earlier, the physical part, which is the non-living part. Like if we're talking here, this is called a tundra. A tundra is like an ecosystem we find where no trees can survive. For example, in the Arctic. It contains the non-living part and the living part. So the living part would be like what animals and plants live in this area here. So this is a tundra. It's the physical part, is the soil and the rock and the snow, and the living part would be the animals and plants that live here. Now, the dominant plant that would live here would be grasses. What non-living factors do you reckon are preventing these trees from growing here? Okay, so think about that. What non-living factors prevent the trees from growing here? Okay, so pause the video and think about that. The answers would be, if we think about it, the very low temperatures, that would be one. Another one would be exposure. The trees are far too exposed to very harsh winds and very low temperatures. Okay. Also, the lack of soil would be important here. The very shallow soil would be important here, that would prevent them from growing. And then there might be other unsuitable things, like, for example, pH might be unsuitable for trees as well, and the amount of light that is present here on the poles. Many of the tundras here are found on the poles of our planet, and is there enough light exposure for them year round to survive? Okay, so in an ecosystem, organisms must survive. And there's many living and non-living factors that would control whether an organism is going to survive or not. So what I want you to do now is I want you to picture foxes living on an island, okay? Foxes are highly successful organisms. I want you to think of them in an island, like, for example, the Aran Islands, and I want you to write down what living or non-living factors would prevent the population from growing. There are many factors there that would prevent them from growing, and I want you to come up with those yourself, okay? So I'm going to skip on now, and you're going to, that's going to be your task for me for tomorrow. Write down the living and non-living factors that are going to have an effect on them. And I'm not going to talk about this yet until tomorrow. Okay, that's enough for today.